Anthony, watching the whole scene unfold, sighed deeply. He had already lost track of what was happening. He could never have expected to see Philip here, especially after all his efforts to avoid meeting him in order to prevent any scandal. Everything happening now seemed to shatter that carefully constructed plan. "Papa!" A child's voice suddenly rang out. Emma ran to Philip and hugged him tightly, as if they had been apart for a lifetime. "Hello, sweetheart." Philip finally caught his breath and lovingly embraced his daughter. He looked exhausted, but his eyes, full of love and care for Emma, softened, despite the heavy situation. Eloise stood off to the side, watching the scene. Inside, she felt a strange mix of realization and bitterness. Her gaze met Anthony's, and there was no surprise in his eyes. The silence between them spoke volumes. Damn. The thought flashed in her mind when she realized that's what it was. They all knew. Her family knew about her relationship with Philip. And now, everything she had tried to hide and avoid suddenly became obvious to everyone. Benedict, still standing nearby, quietly sighed and muttered under his breath. Damn it, Colin. The family, frozen by the unfolding events, could not quite get used to this new reality, where everything turned out to be more complicated than it seemed. The ticking of the old clock on the mantelpiece was the only sound breaking the silence in the room. Everything that had happened seemed unreal, and only this ticking reminded them that time was still moving forward. Michael and Francesca exchanged glances, as if silently coming to a decision. Rising quickly, they began gathering their things to follow Colin. Taking John with them, they left, retreating quietly and leaving the others to their thoughts. A few minutes later, Philip finally rose from his chair. His face was still troubled, but he remained composed. "Prepare a carriage for me," he said quietly but firmly to the servant standing by the door. Anthony watched him, his tension growing. He didn't like how things were developing. There were too many unknowns. He barely held back his irritation, especially seeing how Philip was preparing to leave without saying a word. However, the presence of Emma prevented him from taking more decisive action. He searched his wife's and mother's eyes for support, but there were no answers. Emma, meanwhile, approached her father and looked up at him. "Papa, can I come with you?" she asked, her voice full of hope. Philip stroked her hair gently, smiling softly. "I'm afraid that's not a good idea, my dear. I need to attend to some business, but I'll be back soon," he said, casting a brief glance at Eloise. Though disappointed, Emma nodded and let go of her father's hand. Philip left the room, heading toward the carriage, leaving behind a barely perceptible trace of anxiety. Eloise, having watched all this, felt that staying here, among her relatives, meant an inevitable conversation she wasn't ready for. She was consumed by the realization that she would have to answer many questions. Wanting to avoid this, she quickly rose and, without saying a word, followed Philip. "Where are you going?" Violet's voice suddenly cut through the room, filled with both confusion and light concern. Eloise didn't answer, her pace not slowing. The tension in the room was palpable. Seeing this, Daphne stood up quietly and said, "I'll go after her." This gesture brought some comfort to Violet and Anthony. Anthony looked toward the doorway where Eloise and Daphne had just disappeared, and suddenly realized that now, all those who could provide answers were gone. All except Sophie. Catching his brother's glance, Benedict scanned the room, sighed, and approached the chair where Sophie was sitting, watching everything unfold with a tired smile. "I'm afraid, dear, you're the only one left here," he said with a light smile, masking his confusion. He moved closer and sat on the armrest of her chair, looking at his wife. "And unless you also urgently need to go somewhere, like everyone else, I'd appreciate it if you could answer a few questions." His voice was gentle but firm, and his eyes showed he was expecting answers. Anthony, standing nearby, nodded in agreement, throwing a glance at Sophie. Sophie, realizing there was no avoiding the conversation, gave a strained smile and settled into the chair more comfortably. She carefully picked up her teacup, took a sip, and sighed, understanding that a long conversation awaited her, one where she would have to explain a great deal. "Well then," she said with a light smile, gathering herself, "I suppose we have much to talk about." Without asking for permission, Eloise climbed into the carriage after Philip, and Daphne quickly followed. Philip, slightly surprised to see them, merely nodded, his thoughts elsewhere. The carriage was filled with silence during the ride. Neither sister dared to break it, sensing the tension in the air. They had no idea where they were headed, but they felt something important was approaching. When the coachman announced their arrival, Philip was the first to step out, his face still somber. He gallantly offered his hand first to Eloise, then to Daphne, helping them out of the carriage. Both women stood on the ground, looking around, confused by their unfamiliar surroundings. The place felt foreign and strange. Philip quickly made his way to the entrance of a large building where the carriage had stopped. Eloise and Daphne followed silently, still unsure of why they had come. "Mr. Crane!" a woman's voice called as they approached the entrance. "We weren't expecting you today, but Mrs. Crane is in a good mood, and she'll be happy to see you." "Thank you, Harley," Philip replied curtly, entering the building. Eloise and Daphne exchanged anxious glances and hurried after him, without delay. When they passed Harley, they nodded politely, but their minds were already focused on what lay ahead. "Mrs. Crane?" Daphne thought in surprise. "What is Penelope doing here?" But her question was soon replaced by new confusion when they entered a spacious room. Inside were several people. Some sat at tables quietly chatting, while others wandered around the room mumbling to themselves. Eloise began to sense where they were, and her heart tightened with dread. Daphne's gaze suddenly fell upon the far end of the room, where Marina sat. Her face went pale, and she whispered, "Marina." Next to Marina sat Agatha and Oliver. Marina noticed the arriving guests and jumped up, her face lighting up with a wide smile. She quickly made her way toward Philip, spreading her arms. "George, darling, you're here," she exclaimed. She threw her arms around him, and Philip, gently returning the embrace, gave a bitter smile. "Hello, Marina," he said softly. "I didn't come alone. Daphne and Eloise Bridgerton are with me. Do you remember them?" Marina turned to the sisters with a delighted smile, as if seeing old friends she hadn't seen in years. "Of course I remember. Come in, sit down. We were just discussing Agatha's upcoming wedding," she said cheerfully, motioning for them to sit. The sisters exchanged anxious glances, their faces full of concern and confusion. They followed the invitation and sat at the table. Marina, holding Agatha's hands, continued. "Can you believe it? They've grown up so fast. Just yesterday, I was carrying her under my heart, and now here she is, a bride-to-be. And Oliver has become a marquis. We've done a great job, haven't we, George?" She reached out to Philip, expecting his agreement. Philip remained silent, his gaze filled with sadness as he looked at the children. Agatha and Oliver sat nearby, their faces calm but attentive. "Agatha is truly a remarkable young woman, a true diamond of the season," Daphne said, trying to maintain composure in the increasingly tense atmosphere. "How have you been?" Marina asked the women with a casual smile. "And how is Colin?" Eloise felt her throat go dry. She struggled to find the right words. "Colin. He's doing well," she finally said, her voice hesitant. Noticing Eloise's pregnant belly, Marina smiled and said, "Oh, congratulations." Eloise glanced quickly at Philip, unsure of how to respond. Thank you," she muttered. "You look about the same term as Penelope," Marina added with a smile. "The children will be best friends, just like you." Philip interjected. "Penelope will meet her baby soon." "Already?" Agatha and Oliver exclaimed in unison, their faces showing deep concern. "Everything will be fine," Philip said confidently, though his voice trembled slightly. "She's not alone. Colin is on his way to her." "Oh, I'm so glad that Colin and Penelope found their way to each other," Marina continued carefree. "And that you and I, my dear George, found our way too," she said, addressing Philip with the same confidence. Oliver, sensing the tension rising, stood up. "Excuse me, I must leave." He wanted to make sure Penelope was all right. As Marina tried to embrace Philip again, he gently took her by the wrists and stopped her. "Marina, I'm not George," he said quietly, looking her directly in the eyes. "I'm Philip. Do you remember?" For a moment, the smile on Marina's face froze. She looked at him as if not understanding what he was saying. Then her expression began to change. At first, there was confusion in her eyes, and then something darker, anger. "No, you're lying," she screamed, her voice trembling with rage and pain. "George is alive. This is all your fault." With a scream, she lunged at Philip, her hands clawing at his face and chest, trying to hurt him. She was deranged, refusing to accept reality. Nurses, hearing the noise, rushed over and tried to pull Marina away, but she struggled, continuing to shout at Philip. "You're lying. This is all your fault. You killed him. You ruined everything," she screamed, resisting the nurses who were trying to calm her down. Agatha ran to Marina, trying to hold her and calm her down, her voice shaking with emotion. "Mom, please calm down." But Marina, in her madness, couldn't calm down. Her screams filled the room, causing Daphne and Eloise to freeze in horror. Philip struggled to keep his composure as the nurses finally managed to take Marina away, still screaming and blaming him. With tears in his eyes and a heavy heart, Philip left the room without saying a word. He looked devastated, as though he no longer had the strength to fight the ghosts of the past. Daphne and Eloise remained seated, shaken by what had just happened. Daphne, feeling the unbearable weight of the situation, placed a hand over her heart. Her breathing became uneven. She couldn't believe what she had just witnessed. Eloise, sitting nearby, felt her hands trembling. Everything inside her screamed about the injustice of what had happened. Her heart was breaking for Marina, but she also felt fear. fear of that fragile line she herself was teetering on. After a moment, gathering herself, Eloise abruptly stood up and ran out of the building after Philip. Her heart was pounding in her chest, and she knew she couldn't leave him alone in this state. Daphne followed her, silently observing everything, unwilling to be left behind by her sister. When they stepped outside, they saw Philip sitting on a bench near the entrance. His face was scratched, and his eyes were closed, as though he was trying to block out the world and hide from the pain. He looked completely worn out. His shoulders slumped as if he carried the weight of the entire tragedy. Eloise approached him, feeling a lump rise in her throat, and quietly sat down next to him. Daphne quickly caught up to them, stopping a little behind and handing her sister a handkerchief without saying a word. Eloise, giving her a grateful glance, took the handkerchief and gently sat closer to Philip. Her hand carefully took hold of his chin, lifting Philip's head so she could see all the marks of pain left by Marina. Bloody scratches crossed his face, and the traces of tears mixed with the blood from her nails. Philip's eyes were closed, but as Eloise began wiping away the marks with the handkerchief, he squinted slightly in pain. But he didn't stop her, allowing her to take care of him, no matter how strange it seemed for both of them. "We need to clean and treat the wound," Eloise quietly said, looking into his eyes. Philip slowly nodded, his eyes full of regret and helplessness, as though he was crushed by the fact that he couldn't change the past. They sat in a silence that seemed to thicken around them. Philip finally spoke, his voice low, filled with sadness and guilt. "It's my fault." "She's right," he said bitterly, lowering his head. His words seemed to stick in his throat, as though it was painful for him to admit them aloud. Eloise frowned, feeling Philip's pain and guilt overwhelm him. She continued quietly wiping the blood from his face, but her heart was pounding with anxiety. "What happened?" she finally asked, her voice soft but tense. She knew the answer wouldn't be easy. Philip sighed, his shoulders trembling slightly. He began to speak, and with each word his voice grew quieter, as though the memories weighed on him with unbearable force. "Penelope came to visit us," he began. She was tense. We all noticed how hard it was for her. She decided to go for a walk to clear her mind. We tried to talk her out of it. George tried, I did too, but she left when we were distracted." He paused, clasping his hands into fists, his breathing uneven. "George realized right away that she had left and ran after her," Philip continued, his voice heavy, as though every word was spoken with great effort. "He said to me, 'This isn't Mayfair. It's not safe for women to walk alone here. Stay with Marina and the kids.' And he left." Eloise listened intently, her gaze fixed on Philip's face. She could see how the memories tormented him, but she didn't interrupt, allowing him to speak. Almost an hour passed, and they still hadn't returned. "Marina began to panic, and I went to look for them. When I reached George's carriage, I heard cries for help." Philip paused, his face turning pale, and his hands shook even more. "I found George on the ground. He was bleeding. Penelope was nearby, calling for help. He saved her. Babette couldn't save himself." Eloise closed her eyes, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to fall. She felt the weight of his words and how this pain spread through her own body. Daphne stood nearby, her hands clenched, her face reflecting a mix of pain and sympathy. Philip continued, his voice a little quieter now, but no less powerful. "Marina could never recover from that day. She lost George twice. I brought her here when I realized she couldn't cope anymore. And Penelope. Penelope blamed herself for everything that happened. She swore she wouldn't abandon the kids, and she proposed a marriage of convenience so they could grow up in a complete family. I agreed." Eloise remained silent, but her heart raced at what she was hearing. Philip looked at her, his eyes full of pain. "When Colin came along, I realized I was condemning Penelope to a life without happiness. She would never leave on her own. She wouldn't break her promise," he continued. "So I invited Colin to live with us. We told him everything and he agreed. The only condition was that they keep their relationship hidden from society. I knew it could ruin her life. And then you came along." Eloise looked at Philip closely. She still couldn't believe he had kept all this hidden for so long. His words stirred so many emotions in her: anger, pain, disappointment, but also understanding. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked, her voice quiet but full of sorrow. She felt that this conversation should have happened long ago. Philip looked at her, his eyes filled with regret. "I told you that there was only friendship between Penelope and me. We're family, but not the kind you're used to. We live by different rules. But that doesn't mean I didn't love you." Eloise took a deep breath, her thoughts swirling. She saw the whole picture now, and it became clear to her that she truly couldn't have been part of this life. "I could have been part of this family too," she quietly said, her voice full of regret. Philip shook his head, his eyes sad but resolute. "You couldn't have been," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "You had your school, and you often appeared in society. You couldn't hide like Colin, covering it up with travels. Your absence would have been noticed. You deserve more, Eloise." Eloise met his eyes, her heart aching at this realization. She understood that his words were true, but that didn't ease the pain. She slowly leaned toward him and lightly kissed him on the lips, feeling the warmth and sadness of the moment. The kiss was brief, but it held so much emotion, forgiveness, and gratitude. Quickly standing up, she said, "We need to go. We can't leave Colin alone." Philip stood and, wiping his face, nodded, his face still showing deep pain, but now his eyes held a sense of resolve. He knew that his duty now was to support Penelope and Colin, and the past, as heavy as it was, would remain where it belonged. Daphne, who had been standing nearby the whole time, silently watching, followed them as they all headed for the carriage, knowing that this day had changed everything.